"He left you penniless," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet murmurs of the room, and for a brief second, I thought I had misheard her. Standing there beside my husband's casket in a black coat I had worn to every important moment of our 42-year marriage, but then she stepped closer, her perfume too sweet for a day like this, and brushed an invisible speck from my sleeve as if I were something that needed tidying, something out of place, and I realized she meant every word. I didn't respond, not because I couldn't, but because I had learned a long time ago that silence, when held properly, weighs more than any argument, so I simply adjusted my coat, the same coat Edward once said made me look timeless, and kept my eyes forward as if she had never spoken at all. The funeral home was filled with soft lighting and carefully arranged flowers, white lilies and roses that smelled faintly of something clean and distant, and yet none of it reached me. Not the scent, not the quiet piano music, not the distant voices of people who used to call me family but now stood in small clusters, whispering in tones that stopped the moment I turned my head. I noticed how they avoided my eyes, how even my own son, Daniel, stood across the room beside her, Vanessa Clark, his posture stiff, his hand resting lightly at her back as if he had chosen his side long before today. I had expected grief, perhaps even awkwardness, but not this quiet rearrangement of loyalties, not this subtle rewriting of where I belonged. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked entirely at ease, dressed in a fitted black dress that seemed more suited for an evening event than a funeral, her expression composed, almost rehearsed, as if she had already imagined this day and practiced her role in it, and perhaps she had, because there was a confidence in the way she moved, in the way she glanced occasionally toward the attorney standing near the front, a man I recognized but had not spoken to in months. Something about that glance lingered with me, a small detail that didn't fit, like a word out of place in an otherwise perfect sentence. I folded my hands in front of me and looked at Edward's photograph, the one they had chosen for the service, taken years ago on a summer afternoon by the lake house, before everything became quiet in a different way, before his late nights turned into longer absences, before the conversations between us shortened into polite exchanges about schedules and appointments. I remembered the day he bought that house, how proud he had been, how certain he sounded when he told me it would always be ours, and I wondered, not for the first time, when exactly that certainty had shifted into something else, something I had felt but never fully named. Behind me, I could hear Vanessa speaking again, softer now, almost amused, as if sharing a private joke with the room itself, and though I couldn't catch every word, I didn't need to, because the tone was enough, the quiet assurance of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. I let the moment pass without turning around, without giving her the reaction she was waiting for, because reactions are a kind of currency, and I had no intention of spending mine so cheaply. Instead, I stood there, steady and still, listening to the low hum of voices, the shuffle of shoes against polished floors, the distant closing of a door somewhere down the hall, and I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, not of joy, and certainly not of forgiveness, but of recognition, because beneath the surface of this carefully arranged day, beneath the sympathy and the staged solemnity, something else was unfolding. Something quieter and far more precise, and for the first time since she spoke, I thought not about what I had lost, but about what had been set in motion long before this moment, something that did not require me to raise my voice, something that would reveal itself soon enough, whether she was ready for it or not. I remained where I was for a moment longer after her voice faded into the background, not because I felt frozen, but because I was listening more carefully than anyone in that room could possibly understand, listening not to the words themselves but to the spaces between them, to the way conversations shifted when I took a single step forward, to the way silence followed me like a shadow that no one wanted to acknowledge, and when I finally turned, it was not toward Vanessa but toward the front of the room where the attorney stood, holding a thin black folder against his chest as if it contained something fragile, something that needed to be handled with care, and when our eyes met for just a second, he looked away first, which told me everything I needed to know. I began to walk slowly, my heels making soft, steady sounds against the polished floor, each step measured, each movement deliberate, and I could feel the room adjusting again, conversations lowering, heads turning slightly, not enough to be obvious but enough to confirm that I was still being watched, still being measured against whatever story had already been told about me in my absence. As I passed Daniel, I noticed he did not reach out, did not say my name, and I wondered briefly if he believed what she had said, if he truly thought that after everything, after decades of building a life piece by piece, I could be left with nothing but a coat and a quiet place at the edge of the room, and the thought did not hurt in the way it once might have. It simply settled somewhere inside me, heavy but clear, like a fact that had finally decided to reveal itself. Vanessa's laughter followed me, soft and controlled, the kind of laugh meant to be overheard, and I caught a fragment of her voice again, something about old habits and not knowing when to step aside, and for a moment I allowed myself to remember the first time I met her, how polite she had been, how carefully she had chosen her words, how easily she had fit into our lives as if she had always belonged there, and how slowly, almost invisibly, she had begun to rearrange things, small at first, a suggestion here, a comment there, until one day I realized that the center of the room had shifted and I was no longer standing in it. I stopped a few feet from the attorney and folded my hands again, waiting, not speaking, because there is a certain kind of power in allowing others to fill the silence, and eventually, he cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, glancing once more toward Vanessa before addressing me with a careful tone that sounded practiced, as if he had rehearsed this moment more than once. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and even in the way he said my name, there was hesitation, as if he was unsure whether it still belonged to me, and I gave him a small nod, nothing more, because I did not need reassurance from him or from anyone else in that room. Behind me, I could feel Vanessa watching. I did not need to turn to know that her expression had not changed, that same quiet confidence still in place, the certainty of someone who believes the ending has already been written, and perhaps in her version of the story, it had been. Perhaps she had imagined this exact moment, imagined me standing here with nothing to claim and nowhere to go, imagined herself stepping forward to take what she believed had been promised to her. But stories have a way of shifting when certain details are left out, and there were details she did not know, conversations she had never heard, decisions that had been made long before she ever stepped into Edward's life. I let my gaze drift briefly to the photograph again, to the man I had known for most of my life, and I thought about the last real conversation we had, not the polite exchanges of the final months, but the one before that, the one where he had looked at me with something close to honesty and said, "You always see things coming before I do," and at the time, I had not responded, not because I did not understand, but because I did, and understanding does not always require words. The attorney opened the folder slightly, then closed it again, as if reconsidering the order of things, and that small hesitation told me more than any explanation could have, because hesitation means uncertainty, and uncertainty means that the outcome is not as simple as someone had hoped it would be, and for the first time since Vanessa spoke, I allowed myself to breathe a little deeper, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because whatever was about to be revealed in that room, it was not going to follow the script she had so confidently believed in, and I had no intention of interrupting that realization when it finally arrived. The attorney finally opened the folder with a slow and careful motion, as if even the act itself required permission, and the faint sound of paper shifting inside seemed louder than it should have been in a room that had grown so still that even breathing felt noticeable, and for a brief moment no one spoke, not him, not Vanessa, not even Daniel, who stood just a few feet behind me but felt farther away than he ever had in his entire life. I kept my hands folded, my posture steady, my expression unchanged, because I understood something that none of them did yet. That moments like this are not defined by noise or reaction, but by timing, and timing, when used properly, has a way of revealing truths without ever needing to raise its voice. "We will proceed with the reading of Mr. Edward Whitmore's will," the attorney said, his tone formal but edged with something else, something almost cautious, and I noticed again how his eyes did not linger on Vanessa for as long as they had before, how that quiet confidence she carried was beginning to meet something it had not accounted for, something that did not fit neatly into whatever version of the future she had constructed. Behind me, I heard the faint shift of fabric as she adjusted her stance, the subtle movement of someone preparing to step forward at the exact right moment, and I could almost picture the expression on her face without turning around, composed, certain, already anticipating the words that would confirm everything she had believed, and for a second I wondered if she would recognize the difference when it came, if she would hear it in the tone, in the phrasing, in the small details that often go unnoticed by those who only listen for what they expect to hear. The attorney began with the usual formalities, names, dates, acknowledgments that felt distant and procedural, but I did not lose focus, not for a second, because I was not listening for the beginning, I was listening for the shift, the point where the room would change in a way that could not be undone. Daniel moved slightly closer to Vanessa, and I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass frame of Edward's photograph, his expression tight, uncertain, as if he too was waiting for confirmation of something he had already been told, and I wondered again how much he knew, how much he had chosen to believe, and whether he understood that belief, once tested, does not always return in the same form. To my son, Daniel Whitmore, the attorney read, and there was a slight pause, just long enough to draw attention without making it obvious, and I felt the room lean in, not physically, but in that quiet way people do when they sense that something important is about to be revealed, and then the words continued, measured, precise, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, and I did not turn, I did not react. I simply listened, because the details mattered, the exact language, the order, the intent behind what had been written long before this day arrived. Vanessa's presence behind me shifted again, a small inhale, a subtle adjustment, the kind of movement that carries expectation, and I could almost feel the moment she believed was hers approaching, the moment she had likely imagined more than once, where everything would align in her favor and the room would finally reflect the position she had already claimed for herself. But expectation has a way of narrowing perception, of focusing only on the outcome and not on the path that leads to it, and paths, unlike expectations, can change direction without warning. The attorney cleared his throat again, a quieter sound this time, and turned a page with deliberate care, and in that simple action, I recognized the shift I had been waiting for, not because of what was said, but because of how it was about to be said, the slight tightening in his voice, the careful emphasis that suggested this next part was not as straightforward as the rest, and for the first time since the reading began, I allowed my gaze to move, not toward Vanessa, but toward the folder itself, toward the pages that held more than just instructions, more than just distributions of property and accounts, because within those pages was something else entirely, something that could not be seen at a glance or claimed with confidence, something that required patience to understand and even more patience to accept, and as the attorney prepared to continue, I felt the room shift again, not in sound, but in weight, as if the balance of everything that had been assumed was about to be quietly, but completely, rearranged. In addition, the attorney continued, and that single phrase carried a different weight than everything that had come before it, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, as if it belonged to a separate layer of the document entirely, and I noticed how Vanessa shifted again behind me, a subtle movement that suggested impatience rather than confidence, as though the part she had been waiting for had taken longer than expected to arrive. The attorney adjusted the page slightly and read more carefully now, his tone measured in a way that felt intentional. In recognition of certain circumstances that arose in the final year of my life, I have made specific arrangements regarding the distribution of my primary assets, and there it was, the shift, not dramatic, not obvious, but undeniable to anyone who was paying attention, and I felt the air in the room tighten just enough for it to be noticed without being named. I kept my gaze forward, my posture unchanged, but inside, I followed every word with the same quiet focus I had carried since the beginning, because I remembered that final year, not in fragments, but in patterns, in small details that had not made sense at the time but had slowly arranged themselves into something clearer, something that no one else in that room had taken the time to see. Edward had become careful in a way he had never been before, not distant, not unkind, just deliberate, as if every decision carried a weight he had not previously acknowledged, and there had been conversations, quiet ones, often late in the evening when the house was still, where he would ask questions that sounded simple on the surface but lingered long after they were spoken, questions about trust, about timing, about what remains when appearances begin to shift. All liquid accounts and investment holdings, the attorney continued, are to be placed under the management of a designated trustee until such time as all conditions outlined in this document have been met, and a faint murmur moved through the room, barely audible but present, the kind of reaction that comes when expectations begin to fracture without fully breaking, and I could feel Vanessa's attention sharpen behind me, not in confidence now, but in calculation, as if she were trying to adjust her understanding in real time. I allowed myself a slow breath, steady and controlled, because this was not the moment for reaction, this was the moment for clarity, and clarity, once introduced, does not need to be forced. It unfolds on its own. The attorney paused again, longer this time, and I could sense the room leaning further into that silence, waiting, measuring, trying to anticipate what would come next, and I thought again of Edward, of the way he had looked at me during that last conversation, not with certainty, but with something closer to acknowledgement, as if he understood that certain truths do not need to be spoken aloud to be recognized. The trustee appointed to oversee these assets, the attorney said finally, and his voice carried that same careful precision, is Margaret Whitmore, and for the first time, the room did not remain quiet. The reaction was not loud, but it was immediate, a shift in energy, in attention, in the way people suddenly became aware of something they had not expected to hear, and I did not turn, I did not look at Vanessa, I did not seek confirmation in Daniel's expression, because I did not need to. The words had already done what they were meant to do. Behind me, there was no laughter now, no quiet commentary, only stillness, the kind that follows when certainty begins to dissolve, and I could feel the difference without needing to see it, the absence of that earlier confidence, replaced by something less stable, something searching for footing that was no longer there. The attorney continued, his voice steady but no longer hesitant, as if the most difficult part had already been said, and I listened without interruption, without reaction. Because the moment did not belong to me in the way they might assume, it belonged to the truth itself, unfolding piece by piece, revealing not just what had been decided, but why, and as the words settled into the room, I understood that this was not a reversal, not a sudden change of direction, but the natural result of choices that had been made long before this day, choices that had not required confrontation or explanation, only patience, and patience, when combined with clarity, has a way of outlasting even the most carefully constructed illusions. The words did not echo, they settled, and that was what made them impossible to ignore, because once something settles, it becomes part of the room itself, part of the air everyone is breathing whether they accept it or not, and I could feel that shift now, not dramatic, not chaotic, but unmistakable, like a quiet recalibration that no one had prepared for. Behind me, Vanessa did not speak immediately, and that silence from her carried more weight than anything she had said earlier, because confidence speaks quickly, but doubt takes time, and I imagined her standing there, trying to align what she had just heard with the version of reality she had already decided was true, trying to find the place where it still made sense. The attorney continued, his voice steadier now, as if the uncertainty had passed from him into the room itself. The trustee is granted full discretion over the management, timing, and conditional release of all assets, as outlined in the attached provisions, and I noticed how carefully he emphasized certain words, not loudly, but clearly enough that they could not be overlooked, and I understood why, because those words carried implications that extended far beyond a simple designation. They redefined control, they redefined access, and most importantly, they redefined expectation. I allowed my hands to remain folded, my posture unchanged, but my attention sharpened further, because I knew what came next would not be about titles or positions, it would be about conditions, and conditions are where assumptions begin to unravel. A faint sound reached me then, the soft exhale of someone behind me, not loud enough to draw attention, but present enough to confirm what I had already sensed, and for the first time, I let my awareness extend slightly beyond the front of the room, just enough to register the absence of that earlier composure, the absence of that quiet certainty that had carried itself so easily through the crowd only minutes before. These conditions, the attorney went on, turning another page with deliberate care, include, but are not limited to, the verification of all claims to residency, financial dependency, and relational standing at the time of Mr. Whitmore's passing, and there it was. Again, that careful phrasing, precise and measured, but layered in a way that required attention to fully understand, and I knew that most of the room would not grasp it immediately, not in its entirety, because it was not designed for immediate clarity, it was designed for eventual realization. I thought back to those quiet evenings again, to the way Edward had begun asking about documentation, about timelines, about things that seemed unnecessary at the time, and I remembered how I had responded, not with resistance, but with observation, because there is a difference between questioning a decision and understanding the reason behind it, and I had chosen to understand. Behind me, I heard movement now, a shift of weight, a step that stopped halfway as if reconsidered, and I did not need to turn to know that Vanessa was no longer standing as comfortably as she had been before, that the ground beneath her expectations was beginning to feel less stable, not because anything had been taken from her in that moment, but because something she believed she already possessed was revealing itself to be uncertain. Daniel remained silent, and that silence carried its own meaning, not defiance, not support, just absence, the kind that follows when someone realizes they may not fully understand the situation they thought they did. The attorney paused once more, allowing the words to settle further, and in that pause, I recognized the space where realization begins, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, piece by piece, as each detail finds its place within a larger picture that cannot be ignored. I lifted my gaze slightly, not toward anyone in particular, but forward, steady and composed, because this moment did not require me to act, it required me to remain, to allow the structure that had been set in motion long before today to reveal itself exactly as it was intended, without interruption, without explanation, and as the silence stretched just a second longer than expected, I understood that what had begun as a single sentence, a careless claim spoken with confidence, had now become something else entirely, something that no longer belonged to her voice, but to the truth that was unfolding, one careful line at a time. All claims must be substantiated with documented evidence dated prior to Mr. Whitmore's passing, the attorney continued, and this time there was no mistaking the direction those words were taking. No ambiguity left for interpretation, only a narrowing path that required proof rather than assumption, and I felt the room shift again, not with sound, but with attention, the kind that sharpens when something once taken for granted begins to require justification. Behind me, there was a pause. Longer now, heavier, and I could almost trace the moment Vanessa began to understand that this was not unfolding the way she had expected. That whatever confidence she had carried into this room was not supported by the structure now being revealed, and that realization, even in its early form, has a way of altering posture, of changing the way a person stands, breathes, waits. I remained still, not out of restraint, but out of clarity, because I had seen this coming long before today, not in a dramatic sense, not as a confrontation waiting to happen, but as a quiet series of adjustments that Edward had made, small at first, almost unnoticeable, until they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. There had been a morning, not long before everything began to feel different, when he sat at the kitchen table with a folder much like the one the attorney now held, his coffee untouched, his expression thoughtful in a way that did not match his usual routine, and he had said, without looking up, "Sometimes it is not about what people say, it is about what they can prove," and at the time, I had simply nodded, not because I did not understand, but because I did, and understanding does not always require agreement, it only requires awareness. Any individual asserting financial dependency or entitlement, the attorney continued, must meet the criteria outlined in Section 4, including verified duration of cohabitation and documented financial contribution, and this time, the reaction was not just a shift in energy, it was a pause that held the entire room in place, because those words carried weight. Beyond their formality, they introduced standards, requirements that could not be fulfilled by proximity or assumption alone, and I knew, without needing to turn, that this was where the gap between expectation and reality would begin to widen. I heard movement again, less controlled now, a slight adjustment that suggested reconsideration rather than confidence, and I imagined Vanessa searching through her memory, through whatever assurances she had been given, trying to locate something that could anchor her in this moment, something that would still hold under the conditions now being described, but conditions have a way of exposing what has not been built to last. Daniel remained silent, but his silence had changed, it was no longer passive, no longer distant, it carried a question now, an uncertainty that had not been there before, and I wondered if he was beginning to see the same pattern I had seen, if he was starting to recognize that what had seemed simple was, in fact, anything but. The attorney turned another page, and this time the motion was steadier, more certain, as if the structure of the document itself was guiding him forward, and I followed without interruption, because there was nothing to interrupt, no need to insert myself into a process that was unfolding exactly as it had been intended. I thought again of Edward, not as he was in those final months, but as he had been when decisions mattered, when clarity outweighed comfort, and I realized that whatever doubts I might have carried before had long since settled into something else, something quieter, something that did not require confirmation from anyone else in this room. Failure to meet these conditions, the attorney said, his voice even, will result in the immediate disqualification of any claim to the estate beyond what is explicitly granted under separate provisions. And there it was, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive, a boundary drawn not in emotion, but in structure, and as the words settled, I understood that this was the point where everything shifted from possibility to consequence, where belief would no longer be enough, and for the first time since Vanessa had spoken, I sensed not just uncertainty behind me, but the beginning of something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to dismiss. The room did not move, but something inside it had already shifted beyond repair, and I could feel that shift settle into every corner, into every quiet glance and unfinished thought, as the attorney lowered his voice just slightly, not in hesitation, but in precision, as if what came next required a different kind of attention, a deeper kind, the kind that does not just listen, but understands. Under no circumstances, he continued, shall informal associations or undocumented relationships be considered valid claims against the estate, and the words did not need emphasis, they carried their own weight, their own clarity, and for a moment, no one reacted, not outwardly, because sometimes the most significant changes happen in silence, in the space where realization begins but has not yet found its voice. Behind me, I sensed it before I heard it, the subtle break in composure, the kind that does not announce itself but reveals itself through absence, the absence of movement, the absence of certainty, and I imagined Vanessa standing there, still, but no longer steady, her confidence no longer anchored in anything solid, because what she had relied on was now being quietly, methodically removed. I did not turn, I did not look back, because there was no need to witness something that had already become clear. The truth does not require confirmation when it is unfolding in real time. Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, and I caught a faint reflection of him in the glass beside the doorway, his expression no longer fixed, no longer aligned with what had stood beside him only moments before, and I wondered, not with anger, but with a kind of distant clarity, whether he understood now what had been happening all along, whether he saw the difference between what is said and what is structured, between what is promised and what is secured. The attorney turned another page, and this time there was no hesitation at all, only continuation, as if the document itself had reached the point where everything that followed would no longer need careful introduction, because the foundation had already been laid. Furthermore, he said, any attempt to assert influence over the estate through personal proximity without legal standing shall be considered null, and that word, null, settled differently than the others, final in a way that did not invite interpretation, and I felt the room absorb it, not all at once, but gradually, as if each person needed a moment to adjust their understanding of what had just been defined. Behind me, there was a faint sound then, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft shift of someone taking a step and stopping again, as if uncertain whether to move forward or remain where they were, and in that hesitation, I recognized the exact moment when expectation gives way to realization, when the version of the future someone has built begins to dissolve, not violently, but completely. I allowed my breath to remain even, my posture unchanged, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, the kind that does not interfere, does not interrupt, but simply allows the structure of truth to stand on its own. I thought again of Edward, of the quiet way he had begun to separate appearance from reality in those final months, the way he had stopped accepting things at face value and instead looked for what could be verified, what could endure beyond assumption. And I understood now that what he had set in motion was not an act of correction, but of clarity, a way of ensuring that what remained would reflect not what was claimed, but what was proven. The attorney's voice continued, steady and unwavering, and I followed without effort, because there was nothing left to anticipate, only to observe, only to witness as each line of the document placed another piece into a structure that could no longer be misunderstood, and as the silence deepened once more, not empty, but full with unspoken realization, I knew that whatever had been expected at the beginning of this day no longer existed in the same form, and what remained was something far more precise, far more difficult to challenge, and entirely beyond the reach of anyone who had believed it could be taken without question. The attorney did not pause this time, and that absence of hesitation carried its own meaning, as if the document had moved beyond explanation and into conclusion, and I could feel the room settling into that realization. not comfortably, not willingly, but inevitably, as the last remaining assumptions began to lose their shape, any individual failing to meet the outlined conditions, he said, his tone even and final, shall receive no allocation beyond personal effects explicitly named and itemized prior to this reading, and the words landed with a quiet precision that did not need emphasis, because they did not describe possibility, they defined outcome, and outcomes, once stated, do not bend to expectation. Behind me, there was no movement now, no subtle adjustments, no attempts to reclaim composure, only stillness, the kind that follows when there is nothing left to rearrange, nothing left to reinterpret, and I knew, without needing to see it, that Vanessa had reached that point, the moment where certainty dissolves completely and leaves only the space where understanding must take its place. I remained where I was, my hands still folded, my gaze steady, because there was no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory in the way others might expect, only a quiet acknowledgement that what had been set in motion had reached its natural conclusion, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured clarity that had guided it from the beginning. Daniel shifted once more, but this time it was not uncertainty that defined the movement, it was distance, a subtle step back that did not need to be explained, and I understood it for what it was, not a decision made in that moment, but a recognition of something that had been present all along, something he had not fully seen until now. The attorney closed the folder halfway, not completely, as if leaving the final line suspended just long enough for it to settle into every corner of the room, and in that brief pause, I allowed myself to think again of Edward, not with regret, not with questions, but with a clarity that had taken time to arrive, because whatever had existed between us in those final months, whatever distance had formed, had not erased the understanding that came before it, it had only reshaped it into something quieter, something that no longer required explanation. All remaining decisions regarding distribution, the attorney continued, shall be executed at the discretion of the appointed trustee, in accordance with the documented intentions of Mr. Whitmore, and there it was again, not a repetition, but a reinforcement, a final placement of responsibility that did not need to be defended, because it had already been defined. I could feel the weight of that responsibility settle, not heavily, not as a burden, but as something precise, something that had been considered long before this moment, something that did not ask for reaction, only for understanding. Behind me, the silence remained, unbroken and complete, and I did not turn to face it, because there was nothing there that required my attention anymore, nothing that could alter what had already been established. Instead, I took a slow breath and let it pass, steady and controlled, the way I had done throughout the entire reading, because this moment, like all the others, did not belong to emotion, it belonged to clarity, and clarity, once reached, does not need to be announced, it simply exists. The attorney closed the folder fully now, the soft sound of it marking the end of something that had begun long before any of us entered this room, and as that sound settled into the quiet, I understood that what had once been spoken with confidence, what had once been delivered as a certainty meant to diminish and define me, had now been replaced by something else entirely, something that did not rely on words spoken in passing, but on decisions made with intention, and as the room remained still, holding that understanding without quite knowing how to respond to it, I realized that the final shift had already taken place, not in what had been said, but in what could no longer be believed. For a long moment after the folder closed, no one moved, and I realized that silence had finally taken on a different meaning. It was no longer the kind that waits for something else to happen, it was the kind that acknowledges that everything already has, and I let that settle without interruption, without the need to fill it, because some endings do not require words, they require recognition. Slowly, I rose from my seat, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the same steadiness that had carried me through every moment of this reading, and as I did, I became aware of the subtle shift in attention, not drawn by anything I had said, but by the fact that I had not needed to say anything at all. I turned slightly then, just enough to face the room behind me, and for the first time, I allowed my gaze to rest where I had only sensed before, and there she was, Vanessa, standing exactly where she had been, but no longer occupying the same space in the way she once had, because presence is not defined by where a person stands, but by what supports them, and I could see now that what had supported her before had quietly disappeared. Her expression was not dramatic, not outwardly undone, but it had changed in a way that could not be reversed. The certainty was gone, replaced by something far less stable, something that searched for footing and did not find it, and in that moment, I did not feel anger. I did not feel satisfaction, I felt something much quieter, something that comes when the truth has already spoken for you. Daniel stood a step behind her, not aligned, not distant, but separate in a way that did not need explanation, and I saw in his posture the beginning of understanding, not complete, not fully formed, but present enough to matter, and I held his gaze for just a second, not as a challenge, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement that what had been unclear before no longer was. I adjusted my coat then, the same coat that had been dismissed only a short time ago, and the gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried its own meaning, not as a response to what had been said, but as a quiet reminder that words spoken without foundation do not endure. I took a step forward, then another, moving past them without pause, without hesitation, because there was nothing left behind me that required my attention, nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved, and as I reached the doorway, I allowed myself one final thought of Edward, not as a question, not as something to revisit, but as a recognition of the clarity he had chosen in the end, the structure he had left behind that now spoke louder than any assumption ever could. The hallway beyond the room felt different, not brighter, not lighter, but clearer, as if the air itself carried less weight, and I walked through it with the same measured pace, each step grounded not in reaction, but in understanding, because what had happened inside that room was not a confrontation, it was a revelation, one that did not need to be argued, only seen. Behind me, the silence remained, but it no longer belonged to me, it belonged to those still standing within it, those who would now have to reconcile what they had believed with what had been proven. And I knew that process would take time, because realization does not arrive all at once, it unfolds, just as everything else had today. I reached the end of the corridor and paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of completion, because there is a moment at the end of every chapter where you understand that nothing more needs to be added, nothing more needs to be taken away, and as I stepped forward once more, leaving the building behind me, I understood with absolute clarity that what had been said to diminish me had instead revealed something far more enduring, something that did not rely on anyone's voice but my own quiet certainty, and that was something no one could take, no matter what they had once believed.